interesting parts of my job, I'm also the company's regulatory representative to different national and international bodies. I've had the great pleasure to serve on a number of FDA advisory panels, on a number of AMI working groups, and a number of ISO international working groups. This work has taken me to Europe, across the United States, to Latin America, and here to Asia. And although this is my first time in Jakarta, I'm very pleased that I've already met some people that I know from different locations. And this has really emphasized to me that the infection control community is quite small. And I want to thank all of you for coming today. I appreciate your commitment to continuing education and your commitment to infection control. Let's get started. Today's presentation is going to talk about the evolution of regulatory guidance, particularly regarding the Spaulding classification system. And I'm not going to go into Spaulding. I presume this is something that most of you are familiar with. I want to talk about the debate around Spaulding and how it's changed in response to a healthcare crisis in the United States and the subsequent response to that crisis. This is a quick chart of the Spaulding classification system. I want to draw your attention to the area that's highlighted. This is the reprocessing of semi-critical devices. And for decades, the recommendation has been that high-level disinfection is adequate for semi-critical devices. And this has been okay for really the 50 years or so that Spaulding has been in effect. However, recently this has changed. This is from an FDA presentation in 2019, where FDA itself is proposing an evolution to the Spaulding system. And again, I draw your attention to the highlighted portion of this chart. Now, FDA is saying that for semi-critical devices, high-level disinfection is acceptable only if sterilization is not practical. The question is, why this change? Why the need for the change in recommendations? In 2013, about 10 years ago, the American Center for Disease Control alerted FDA to the fact that there was a growing number of infections linked to improperly reprocessed endoscopes, specifically duodenoscopes. By 2015, this had become a national crisis in the United States. There were infections at 6 major hospital groups across the US. Over 250 patients were seriously injured by these infections. Over 25 patients died. And in this environment, there was a great deal of pressure on FDA to do something. I throw this up as a sample of the news stories that were taking place in the United States back in 2015. This was really the first time that superbugs, multi-drug resistant organisms, had made it into the national news and became part of the national debate. And it was really the first time that people were alerted to the fact that these organisms were a real threat. In 2015, FDA had a number of responses to this outbreak. They issued a number of safety alerts and communications, the most important of which was a recommendation of 4 supplemental measures that were designed to combat the infection. And they were encouraging hospitals to take these additional steps in the midst of this outbreak. At the end of 2015, as the outbreak was subsiding, FDA took the additional step of going to the major endoscope manufacturers and requiring that they do field surveillance studies. And in these field surveillance studies, the endoscope manufacturers had to go out to hospitals that were using their instruments, and after the hospital had reprocessed the instrument according to their instructions for use, the scope manufacturers had to do microbiological testing and see how successful that reprocessing was. The results of this field surveillance were shocking. Over 10% of the scopes that were tested still had viable organisms on them. Over 5% of the scopes had organisms of high concern, pathogenic organisms that would cause disease. Of the FDA's 4 supplemental measures, the one that most hospitals had adopted was dual high-level disinfection cycles. So these would be back-to-back or double cycles of high-level disinfection. And FDA discovered that multiple cycles of high-level disinfection were no more effective than a single cycle of HLD in eliminating these organisms. Also significantly, ethylene oxide was one of the supplemental measures that FDA recommended. And very significantly, every hospital that adopted ethylene oxide sterilization ended their outbreak immediately. In this 2019 conference, FDA published this validation study. And this study really quantifies the difference between high-level disinfection, liquid chemical sterilization, and ethylene oxide sterilization. And I'll draw your attention to the column here on the far right. You'll see that high-level disinfection and liquid chemical sterilization are capable of achieving a 6-log reduction in bacteria. Ethylene oxide, on the other hand, achieves that in half of its sterilization cycle. In a full cycle, ethylene oxide achieves a 12-log reduction in bacteria. This is what's known as an overkill cycle. This is what is regarded as true sterilization. And I show you this because there is a very significant difference between high-level disinfection and sterilization. In 2019, the focus was on duodenoscopes. Very rapidly, it became clear that the problem was more than just duodenoscopes. Industry researchers, endoscope specialists, infection control specialists began identifying scopes linked to infections, other scope types linked to infections. This included colonoscopes, bronchoscopes, duodenoscopes, gastroscopes, and ureteroscopes, cholecystoscopes, the list goes on. But by 2019, we were aware that there was a major problem in U.S. healthcare. AMI, the American Association of Medical Instrumentation, is the body in the United States that develops regulatory guidance for the medical device industry. And in 2015, they took up the subject of endoscopes and started a new working group specifically dedicated to endoscope reprocessing. And I was very pleased to be one of the founding members of this working group. In 2021, AMI published its guidance on endoscope reprocessing. And very significantly, this document makes a number of points. Number one, the threat of multi-drug resistant organisms is growing. It's getting worse, not better. Number two, the threat of these MDROs is linked not just to duodenoscopes, as we've said, but to gastroscopes, ureteroscopes, cystoscopes, colonoscopes, and bronchoscopes. It is a widespread problem. And this last point I'll draw your attention to. This is what I think is most significant. AMI and other groups that have done deep research into these outbreaks have discovered a very, very disturbing fact, and that is that in almost all cases, and I read from this, the processing or the equipment could not always be identified. Failures in the processing or equipment could not always be identified. The facilities were following the guidelines and manufacturers' written instructions for use. The equipment was working, The operators were doing everything properly. The organisms were surviving. At this point in time, the standard of care is high-level disinfection, and again, the organisms were surviving this processing. The conclusion in this AMI guidance document, which, by the way, I would encourage all of you who are involved in endoscope reprocessing to purchase. It has a wealth of information in it. The conclusion in this document is that it is advised that flexible and semi-rigid endoscopes to be used in semi-critical applications be sterilized prior to use. That right there is the reclassification of Spaulding. Semi-critical devices, endoscopes, should be sterilized. So, where we are today, I'd like to talk about the options available to all of us in the Infection Control Committee. And I'd like to talk particularly about the pros and cons of the different technologies available to us, because they all have strengths, they all have weaknesses. We're going to start with high-level disinfection and liquid chemical sterilization, which I know most of you are very familiar with. The advantages of this process, it tends to be fast, it's relatively inexpensive, and it's relatively easy. The cleaning part is not easy, but the automated endoscope reprocessors tend to be pretty simple to use. The disadvantages, however, are numerous. The chemicals that are used in these systems can be corrosive, particularly the peracetic acid. Scopes need to be properly rinsed after they've gone through these processes, and they need to be rinsed with ideally sterile water. And sterile water can be frequently difficult to come by. They need to be properly dried. And this is a very big deal because a scope that retains any moisture can promote the growth of biofilms. And biofilms can grow over time. They are very difficult to eradicate, and they can harbor disease-producing organisms. Finally, scopes that have been going through high-level disinfection need to be stored properly. In the United States, the standard is putting them into a scope cabinet. Frequently, the scope cabinets themselves are not well maintained, and they can become their own source of recontamination of the scopes. But again, the big issue, going back to the FDA's 2019 report, is that high-level disinfection is not always successful in eliminating these very dangerous organisms, and multiple cycles of high-level disinfection are not successful in eliminating these organisms. This is a very big deal. The multi-drug resistant organisms that we're seeing now are increasingly resistant to the antibiotics of last resort, at which point the doctors have very little recourse. Next, I'd like to talk about hydrogen peroxide sterilization. Hydrogen peroxide is true sterilization. It is fast. It provides biological results, which high-level disinfection does not. And very significantly, it affords the use of terminal packaging, so that you can package a scope and it remains sterile when you've removed it from the sterilizer, and it's sterile until that scope is used. The disadvantages of hydrogen peroxide are significant also. There are a great many materials that you cannot put into a hydrogen peroxide sterilizer. These systems tend to have small chambers, which means that you're running them throughout the day, which increases your consumable costs. But for today's conversation, I'd like to focus on one of the limitations of hydrogen peroxide that is not widely discussed, and that is that hydrogen peroxide systems can only process shorter scopes. This spreadsheet shows 3 of the most popular hydrogen peroxide systems in the United States and their FDA clearances. And as you see, these systems have been cleared for a range of shorter scopes, bronchoscopes, cystoscopes, ureteroscopes. They have not been cleared for duodenoscopes, for gastroscopes, for long colonoscopes. There are a number of technical reasons for this, but these systems are not appropriate for the longer scopes that we've been discussing. Which brings us back to ethylene oxide. The advantages of ethylene oxide are well known. It is, in many ways, one of the most reliable sterilization technologies available. In the United States today, more than 50% of all new medical devices are still sterilized with ethylene oxide, and this is because of the broad material compatibility of the gas. Again, it's a terminal sterilization process. There are a wide range of packaging materials that are compatible with ethylene oxide. It's a very delicate process. Ethylene oxide is non-corrosive, and so it will not damage scopes, it will not damage other instruments that you're processing. And very significantly, at the end of an ethylene oxide process, you're left with a scope that is completely dry. There is no potential for the growth of biofilms. And a number of researchers in the United States have said this may be the most important thing about ethylene oxide sterilization, the fact that you end up with a bone-dry scope. The disadvantages of ethylene oxide are also well known. Ethylene oxide has a much longer cycle time. You've got the need to aerate instruments at the end of the cycle, and there are growing concerns over the risks associated with ethylene oxide. And again, we go back to the FDA's 2019 report. The big issue they found with ethylene oxide, again, every hospital that used ethylene oxide for the reprocessing of their scopes ended outbreaks immediately. The gas was very, very effective. However, back in 2019, FDA discovered that only about 12% of American hospitals were still using ethylene oxide. Today, the number of US hospitals that have ethylene oxide available to them is less than 10%. And the question is, if this is such an effective sterilization method, why is it falling into disuse? And for that, we have to look at some of the early ethylene oxide systems. And for many of you here, you're going to be familiar with these issues. The early ethylene oxide systems used very large tanks. These tanks leaked. They had to be kept in their own special ventilated rooms. And a 47-liter tank of ethylene oxide presents a fair amount of risk. And again, if these tanks leaked, you would have to evacuate the wing of the hospital they were in. There was a real problem with them. By the 1980s, the single-use cartridge was introduced. This was a big step forward because instead of a 47-liter tank, you were down to 100 to 170-gram cartridge. But the problem with both of these systems were pretty much the same. Both the tanks and the cartridges leaked. They had to be maintained in special ventilated storage areas. These systems required a fairly large amount of gas to sterilize. Sterilization and aeration took place in different cabinets, so someone had to move product from the sterilizer to a separate aeration cabinet, and this provided the potential for exposure during the transfer of product. The systems required a large amount of space. Many of you probably remember the old ethylene oxide systems that were literally built into a wall, and there was a service room behind the sterilizers that had the air compressors and water lines and vacuum lines. Finally, these systems, when emissions abatement equipment is required, they use so much gas that scrubbing the gas, removing the gas from the exhaust, can be complicated and expensive. I want to talk today about advances in ethylene oxide technology. And one of the great misconceptions that we run into is the belief that ethylene oxide sterilization hasn't changed. And this simply is not true. Ethylene oxide has developed dramatically over the last 10 years. And the dramatic improvement has been in flexible chamber technology. And I'll start off with this slide. We have gone from 47-liter tanks to 170-gram cartridges. Today, we have cartridges that are only 17 grams. So you have had a steady decrease in the amount of ethylene oxide necessary to sterilize. The advantages of flexible chamber ethylene oxide addresses many of the traditional problems with the ethylene oxide systems that many of you are familiar with. We're using very small cartridges, and these cartridges contain ethylene oxide that is flame sealed in glass. And a glass ampule full of ethylene oxide is not going to leak. The glass ampules are protected in a plastic cartridge. This is the only way that we have found to make sure that you have a system that does not leak gas during storage. What we want to show here is the flexible chamber is a plastic sterilization bag that is inside of a dedicated cabinet. We refer to this as a chamber inside of a chamber. And this is very significant because the sterilizer is this bag, and the sterilizer is inside of its own vent hood. Many ethylene oxide installations have put the ethylene oxide sterilizer in a separate room. We've done this by putting the ethylene oxide sterilizer, the bag, inside of a dedicated negative pressure cabinet so that any leaks are into that cabinet. This is a very compact tabletop design. We've got one out in the lobby that we can show you, but this is very different from the very big, bulky ethylene oxide systems that many of you may be familiar with. Sterilization and aeration are taking place in the same cabinet. The operator is never going to be unloading the sterilizer. We're coming in contact with products until they're fully aerated. And lastly, because we're using such a small amount of gas, emissions abatement tends to be quite easy and relatively inexpensive compared to other systems. The disadvantage, and as I said, all systems have pros and cons, the disadvantage is still a relatively long cycle time. This is going to be an overnight cycle. Sterilization is going to take 6 hours. Aeration is going to be 6 hours after that for most endoscopes. I have a short video here.
How does Andersen's ethylene oxide flexible chamber technology sterilization process work? Ethylene oxide flexible chamber technology is Andersen's proprietary and award-winning sterilization process. It's shared by the Andersen Amproline and EO-Gas 4 models. This cutaway of an Andersen sterilizer reveals a loaded sterilization bag flexible chamber secured with a blue strap around the purge probe. The sterilization cycle begins by purging excess air from the sterilization bag, the flexible chamber. Air molecules, represented by the blue dots, are exhausted from the sterilization bag through the purge probe and purge tube. With excess air removed, the ethylene oxide, EO or ETO, concentration in the sterilization bag is maximized during sterilization, thereby minimizing the amount of EO needed for effective sterilization. Once the initial purge is complete, the gas cartridge is manually activated by pressing the button on the cartridge through the wall of the sterilization bag. Ethylene oxide, represented by the purple dots, spreads throughout the sterilization bag and permeates the items being processed. The gas-impermeable flexible chamber maintains a high gas concentration during the sterilization cycle. At the end of the sterilization cycle, ventilation of the sterilization bag begins. 30 minutes ventilation after the 3-hour gas exposure and 1 hour after the 6-hour gas exposure. A valve in the purge probe opens, allowing fresh air, represented by the blue dots, to travel down the probe and into the back of the bag. Ethylene oxide, represented by the purple dots, is exhausted through the purge probe. Aeration continues after ventilation, flushing air through the sterilization bag and out the purge tube. Aeration of the devices in the sterilization bag ends when the operator exits the cycle to remove the sterilization bag from the sterilizer.
It's a very significant improvement over traditional ethylene oxide because of that ability to reduce the size of the chamber to the size of the load that you're sterilizing, so there is no dead space. That's really the key to this process. This is a summary from our FDA 510K. I will draw your attention to specifically the length and diameter of endoscope lumens that we are able to sterilize. That is this right up here. We have been cleared to sterilize lumens that are over 3,500 millimeters in length and equal to or greater than 1.2 millimeters in diameter. This is about an 11-foot scope, almost 4 meters. And since we presented this information to FDA, we have presented additional information to the agency, and we have now shown that this system can sterilize a 4-meter lumen that is only 1 millimeter in diameter. You may ask, what scope has a 4-meter lumen to it? Well, this is a particular colonoscope with a very long water jet channel. And those of you that know colonoscopes, there are working channels. There's also a water jet channel that tends to be a good deal longer, and FDA requires that you demonstrate that you can sterilize this water jet channel to be able to get a sterilization claim. And there is no other process on the market that we are aware of that can sterilize a 4-meter, 1 millimeter in diameter lumen. This is over 13 feet. So I want to conclude by summarizing the options available to people. 25 years ago, most hospitals used ethylene oxide exclusively for their low temperature sterilization. Everything went into the ethylene oxide sterilizer. Those days are gone. Today, hospitals have a wide range of decontamination technologies available to them. And again, they all have pros and cons. High-level disinfection will continue to be popular. It's going to be appropriate for many applications, and most U.S. hospitals are still using it for reprocessing of lower-risk scopes. Hydrogen peroxide, because of its speed, is not going to be replaced. There is also going to be a place for ethylene oxide. And at this point, I'll say that many people come to us and they ask, what is the best decontamination method? And really, that question has no meaning. It's like asking, what is the best golf club? If I asked any of you, what is the best golf club? The answer is, well, it depends on where you are on the golf course. And the same is true of decontamination technology. The best one depends upon the nature of the instrument, the nature of the procedure that it's going to be used on. And I'll come back to the challenges that we were talking about earlier in this presentation, specifically the growing threat of endoscope infections and the growing threat of multi-drug resistant organisms. These are two problems that are not going away. Spalding has been updated. FDA, AMI, American industrial leaders now are all calling for the sterilization of flexible and semi-rigid endoscopes to be used in semi-critical applications. Again, this is a major change. It hasn't happened across the United States, but this is the direction that the industry is moving. And flexible chamber ethylene oxide systems and the Andersen EO-Gas 4 are the only systems that have been cleared by FDA for the terminal sterilization of longer endoscopes, duodenoscopes, gastroscopes, colonoscopes. As you're looking at your decontamination resources, the technologies available to you, I would suggest that a flexible chamber ethylene oxide system is an excellent complement to your other systems. You may not be using an ethylene oxide system every day, but for your most vulnerable patients and your most critical instruments, this is an excellent sterilization method. And for longer scopes, ethylene oxide is not the best way of sterilizing them. Right now, flexible chamber ethylene oxide is the only way of sterilizing these longer scopes. I would like to stop now for some questions. I will also mention that this presentation is available upon request for anyone who would like a copy of it. We have 3 pages of references to FDA guidance and different studies on the scopes that we've mentioned that are available if you'd like to do more research on this topic. Thank you all very much.